I think that we are live.
I think we are.
Hi, everyone. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flipping the Script on Climate. We are so excited that you are here. I'm Taryn O'Neill.
And I'm Tamara Krinsky, and we are so glad that you could join us today for this event celebrating and exploring science and storytelling. We want to begin with a land acknowledgement. While our audience members are from all over the country and some from without, Taryn and I are located in Los Angeles, and we acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples.
So Tamara and I are co-founders of Scirens, aka the Screen Sirens for Science. We're also entertainment multi-hyphenates. So I'm a sci-fi writer, director, producer, and Tamara is a broadcast host, writer, and an actor. And together we're a creative team that exists at the intersection of storytelling and science. So we focus on creating entertainment that encourages curiosity and critical thinking and really bold new visions for a rapidly changing world.
Which is why it is no surprise that right now we're thinking about climate and the state of our planet, especially with the UN Climate Conference, COP26, just having wrapped up. Look, we have all seen a lot of gloom and doom stories in media and entertainment about how we humans are ruining the earth. And come on, let's be honest, right? Melting icebergs, superstorms, they're really dramatic. But those stories don't help us to imagine the sustainable future that we need and we think we can actually achieve. So for people to be inspired to tackle our global climate crisis, the story needs to change.
And that's why we're here today. So we've brought together actors, writers, climate scientists, and activists to explore optimistic visions of what a sustainable world could actually look like where innovation and imagination collide. So we're going to be reading climate fiction stories that are all supported by science and technology consultants. So these are powerful narratives that are actually possible futures. Here's what you're going to be seeing today. So we're going to begin with performances, which feature Mark Anthony Samuel, Tara Platt, Monty Hernandez, Cristina Ochoa via video, David Blue, and Kavi Ramachandran Ladner. So they will all be bringing excerpts from climate fiction short stories and from one book, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. Then we'll have writer and activist Gia Mora, who will share her thoughts on creating your own place in the climate story. And this is a video from her. And then we'll have a panel conversation with Dr. Kate Marvel, author of Vandana Singh, Dr. Manjana Milkoreit, and myself. And Tamara will be moderating that. And we're going to be talking about fact and fiction and the role storytelling has to play in creating these futures.
Now, we, of course, could not have done this without some incredible collaborators from the science, tech, and entertainment communities. So we want to give a huge thanks to our two presenting partners. First, New York City women filmmakers. When Taryn and I said we needed a partner to help us do this and bring this vision to life, executive director and founder Sydney Hugh responded immediately with production support. NYCWF is a wonderful community for filmmakers, and this event today is just one of the many examples of how they help creators to bring their projects to the world. Second, we want to give a huge shout out to our partner, Ed Finn and Joey Esrich at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. A bunch of the stories you're going to hear today come from their anthologies, which you can find for free on their website, and you'll be hearing more from Ed in just a moment.
We also want to give big thanks to the Science and Entertainment Exchange and to Tara Platt and Yuri Lowenthal's Monkey Kingdom Productions. You'll see Tara performing today. They both helped connect us to performers and panelists for this event. And a note, if you are kind enough to make a donation when you purchased your free ticket, those will all be going to the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council. They have a new initiative called Rewrite the Future, which we're in big support of. Without further ado, I would love to welcome the director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at ASU, Ed Finn.
Thank you so much, and hello everybody. We're so thrilled to be partnering with Scirens and everybody else in this fantastic event. Greetings from the Center for Science and the Imagination, currently operating out of my house, but we're based at the Tempe campus of Arizona State University. And so we would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Akimal-O'odham, Yavapai, Pipash, and other indigenous nations and peoples that have inhabited this land in Arizona for centuries. Their keeping and care and imagination of these lands allows us to be here today. So the mission of the Center for Science of the Imagination is to inspire collective imagination for better futures. How do we get people to feel a sense of agency and responsibility towards the future? We've been at this for almost a decade now, and we really believe in the power of storytelling to invite people to imagine possible worlds and to cultivate a sense of hope and possibility, to think not just about what could happen, but how we could make the future world better. So in that spirit, this past year, we launched the Climate Imagination Fellowship, which is the latest in a series of climate futures projects and anthologies that we have done over the past decade. And we're really excited to see several of the stories, not just and writers involved in these projects represented here today. It's really wonderful to see that. And our mission with this new fellowship is really to inspire communities around the world and people around the world to start imagining their own positive climate futures. What are we trying to work towards? What is the vision of success? What is the vision of a world that we want to live in, where we adapt and we are resilient and we contend with all of the incredible challenges, and they are going to be really hard, but how do we work towards a vision of humanity that is flourishing and inclusive and inspiring for everybody? How do we get more people to start feeling empowered to imagine their own futures? So if you'd like to take part beyond showing up for this awesome event, you can go to the climateimagination.org website. You can send someone a postcard from the future. We have some amazing art there. But for right now, it's my pleasure to kick back. I'm done now. I just get to listen to this wonderful program, hand things over to our readers for the storytelling part of this event.
Hi, I'm Mark Anthony Samuel, and I'm reading Efficiency by Paolo Bacigalupi. We talk about wind, solar, and hydroelectric technology, but another way to create clean energy is through weights, dropping really big ones down cables and harnessing the kinetic energy that gravity helps create. In the city of Chicago, my character, James, is a young man working for GLA, the energy behemoth that runs the city's energy system. With the help of an irreverent AI named Lucy, James maintains the weight pulley system on the side of the Willis Tower. But he also has family ties to a small upstart renewable energy business run by his father, who thinks GLA is enemy number one. Are you finished? Lucy asks. Does it feel like I'm finished? James braces his feet against thin film PV windows, waves in at worker bees at their workstations, starts chiseling again, suspended from his harness. The first time he worked this high, he almost broke. Only stubborn pride kept him from giving up on his dream of working the biggest and most bizarre energy storage project Chicago had yet launched. Only the thought of his father looking at him with "I told you so" contempt kept him from begging to come down. The first time up the face of Willis Tower, he'd focused his eyes only on his work, only on the cables and electromagnetic guide rails and the catwalks, never looking around, not permitting himself to see how far down everything was, how open the air was, not permitting himself to think about how much his hands were shaking, hell, how much his whole body was shaking. That first time, Lucy must have read his pulse or heard the crack in his voice, because she'd been kind and supportive, encouraging even. At the end of the day, back on the ground, Fitz handed James a celebratory homebrew, and James had watched, fascinated at the way the bottle shook in his hands, at the jitters that lingered. These days, James is mostly afraid of how comfortable it feels to work on an energy storage system more than 1,000 feet in the air and banter with its AI. Sometimes in the summer, he sits up on a catwalk with solar protein sandwiches from home, watching people in their apartments in the neighboring towers. Rich people who pay not just to see Lucy's weighted columns and the rise of Willis Tower, but also to keep the weights lit up at night with LEDs, making for a skyline view that raises their property values by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lucy has security cameras all over herself. She likes to point them at the windows across the way and tell them where the exhibitionists are. Lucy thinks meat people are hilarious. Now, dangling high above all of Chicago, instead of turning his face from the view, Instead of facing energy exchange traders grinding out spreadsheets on their monitors on the other side of the translucent solar glass, he turned slowly, dangling, looking south to home. South side, Hyde Park, further south. From this height, he can see the solar panels all across the buildings there, can make out some of the streets that his father redesigned, see the solar panels that he grew up servicing, replacing, rewiring, shoveling off in winter, washing in summer. It was there that he'd learned about direct and alternating current, voltages and watts, silicon cells, and perovskites. Why the fuck would you want to work at Great Lakes Amalgamated? His father had asked when James first broke the news about his new job. They'd been in the kitchen, warm with the smell of cornbread and solar teen baking. The house, tight and cozy, just the way his father had made it, refitting the old brick row house until it was completely independent of energy demands other than those that he could generate himself. Why wouldn't I? James retorted. GLA's doing amazing things. His father shook his head. They're doing amazing things now. Now that we got them on the run, now they're doing amazing things. Now they're saving their asses. Now that half the South Side has walked away from their shitty power. Now that people can say no to them. I never met a utility that cared about people until those same people showed how much they didn't need it. And then, what do you know? The utility turns on a dime and starts talking about how much it loves green energy and cares about vulnerable people and their bills and whatever the hell. GLA can't hide behind their lawmakers and lobbyists now. Can't hide behind their monopoly. You don't know what it was like before. Them shutting off the lights on people who couldn't pay. Good people trying to just make rent. Trying to decide whether to pay for electric or blood pressure meds or asthma meds or keep the heat on and lights on. Shit. Juggling all of that. Back then, GLA didn't give a damn. And now they act like they do? They're not the same as they were before, James tried to explain. But his father wouldn't hear it. His father had started Hood Electric from this very house on the south side of Chicago. He'd made a name for himself, rags to riches, changing not just the fortunes, but the physical makeup of the place. Now he did speaking tours, ran workshops. People made pilgrimages to meet him, to learn from him, to take that learning back to their own neighborhoods, to replicate the same radical synergies he had unleashed: energy independence, education, food security, energy security, community prosperity, connectedness, neighborhoods woven together instead of shattered. What are you two shouting about? Grandmama asked, coming into the room. He wants to sell out to those parasitic motherfuckers. James' dad broke off at Grandmama's stern look. GLA. Grandmama looked from Dad to James, and James braced for her rebuke. But instead, she said mildly, he's got a job. If I remember rightly, you didn't want to even learn electrical engineering when you got out of prison. And now you're going to tell your son not to use what you taught him, but not to be productive? I didn't teach him all that so he could go work for the man. But look what they're doing, James protested. They're putting up wind turbines in Lake Michigan. It's not like Hood Electric could go out there and start putting up wind turbines. That's no DIY project. And they've got big storage. Look at Willis Tower. This isn't home battery backups. They do huge things. Oh, so you don't think what I've done is huge, his father said. It's not that, James tried to find the words. It's just, I know how to install solar panels. I know how to do mini smart grids. I know how to plant gardens under a solar trellis, but it's all maintenance now, unless I go to some other city, unless I go on the road all the time doing installs. You did it all. I want to do something new too. I want to try something new.
Hello, I'm Tara Platt, and I am reading an excerpt from Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry from the Future. The story begins in 2025 with the Ministry for the Future being formed out of the UN's Paris Agreement. The purpose of this small Zurich-based team is to advocate for the health and safety of future generations, and they face the mightiest of challenges with climate change. The plot centers around the head of the ministry, Mary Murphy, a former foreign minister from Ireland. Mary and her group attempt to challenge the entrenched carbon-driven global infrastructure, the stakes rising as climate emergencies escalate. The story of a world in crisis is also told through an on-the-ground account from unnamed eyewitnesses and from a relief worker who strives devastating heat dome event in India. But the tide begins to turn, with the ministry convincing economic powers to introduce a carbon coin to incentivize keeping fossil fuels in the ground and supporting geoengineering in the Arctic, all while fighting off the dark forces of entrenched power and money. We meet Mary now as she prepares to voyage across the Atlantic to an important meeting with the world's central banks on a new type of clean energy vessel. The ship carrying Mary, the Cutting Snark, was 250 feet long. And when it got going fast enough and the ocean was calm, a set of hydrofoils deployed from its sides, and the ship then lifted up out of the water a bit and hydrofoiled along at an even greater speed. The whole experience struck Mary as marvelous. She had thought she would get seasick. She didn't. She had a cabin of her own, tiny, ship-shape, with a comfortable bed. Every morning, she woke at dawn and got breakfast and coffee in the galley, then took her coffee out to a deck chair in the shade and worked on her screen. The other passengers aboard had their own work and friends and left her alone, although if she sat at one of the big round tables to eat, there were always people happy to talk. The air was salty and cool, the clouds tall and articulated, the sunsets big and gorgeous, the stars at night fat and numerous, the salty air more than compensated for by the truly dark skies. Then the new moon fattened night by night until it threw a bouncing silver path out to the twilight horizon, sky over water, indigo on cobalt, split by a silver road. It was beautiful. And she was getting her work done. So where had this obsession with speed come from? Why had everyone caved to it so completely? Because people did what everyone else did. Because first, no one could fly. Then everyone could fly if they could afford it. When flying was sublime. But also now a crowded bus ride, a hassle. And now, on most of the planes Mary flew on, people closed their window shutters and flew as if in a subway car, never looking down at all, incurious about the planet floating 10 kilometers below. On the 8th day, her ship sailed into New York Harbor, a dream of a harbor, Cosmopolis itself, and she debarked on a Hudson dock and took a cab to Penn Station and got on a train headed west. The Americans had finally gotten some high-speed rail built, and including this cross-continent line, so it was only another day, and then she was in San Francisco, coming up out of the ground and walking over to the big tower and taking an elevator up to the top, where she had met with the central bankers years before. Her trip had taken 9 days, and she had worked every day as if home in Zurich, except that she got more done. And the carbon burn, as calculated by Bob Wharton's own personalized calculator, had been the same as if she would have stayed at home. And the ocean crossing had been beautiful. She had sailed across the Atlantic and now stood before a picture window in the big tower, looking across a huge wedge of the Pacific. Amazing. "We've been so stupid," she said to Jane Jablinski, still chair of the Federal Reserve. She had been reappointed by a new president who had been terrified by all the changes. Jablinski looked mystified as she tried to parse which stupidity Mary might be referring to. Mary did not elucidate. Not immediately, anyway. She needed to hear how they thought things were going first. The group talked over events they often named: the heat wave, crash day, the Little Depression, the transition, the intervention, the strange times, the super depression, and she saw it all again. These were the rulers of the world, if indeed anyone could be called that. Maybe not. Maybe that was the change they were trying to catch with all their glib names. The system as such had escaped them. Change itself was changing. Still, they undoubtedly held a lot of power, whatever power remained. No doubt about that, because money mattered. Now they were gathered to discuss the first years of the big experiment, what Bob Wharton called their Hail Mary, the carbon coin. Time for a reckoning. Had it done what they hoped it would? Had it worked? Yes and no and maybe. The usual answer to any question these days. They agreed on these points. The new carbon coin had stimulated many short-term investments in carbon sequestration projects and many longer-term investments in the coin itself. It had caused some of the biggest carbon owners to cash out and keep fossil carbon in the ground, or use it for plastics if they could. Coal had become just a black rock you could turn into money by leaving it alone. They had created and paid out trillions of carbon coins, and yet had seen no signs of inflation or deflation for those who held that theory, no noticeable price change. As part of altering the investment climate further, their staffs had written up draft legislation to propose to their government several related reforms, including strong currency controls, attacking and eliminating tax havens, shifting all money from cash to digital forms tracked by blockchain technologies, and mounting the pressure on carbon by way of increased taxation and regulation. A lot of momentum on those fronts now. This all sounds good, Mary said at the end of the day. So, now what else can you do? They regarded her. You tell us, they said. What kind of thing did you have in mind?
Hi, my name is Montse Hernandez, and this is Things That Bend But Don't Break by S.B. Divya. This story brings us to a future Puerto Rico after a super hurricane has destroyed much of the island. Funded by the federal government with help from some charity-minded celebrities, Puerto Rico rebuilds its infrastructure with renewable energy technologies like solar and wave power. Electric scooters and high-speed rails replace car transport. And my character, Tanama, who has just gotten a college acceptance letter to a prestigious university in New York City, is creating a self-sustaining compound on an illegal piece of property. Their renewable power held by an unlikely piece of produce, but it's now under threat. Tanama, Yuisa called out, spying her before she could say hello. Tanama greeted her with a hug and a kiss as the others hooted and yelled rowdy hellos. Yuisa was 2 years older, but her head barely reached Tanama's shoulders. She had stick-straight black hair and the classic features of the Taino people, unlike Tanama, who had some European heritage. It's so beautiful, Tanama breathed, her gaze torn between Yuisa's face and the waterfall. Yuisa grinned. Yes, the pool filled up yesterday after yesterday's storm, and Mateo got the turbines working this afternoon. The falling water is powering its own lights. Isn't it great? Tanama nodded. Yuisa was the mad genius behind this village, finding clever ways to keep it as self-sufficient as possible. But she was also a good leader. She'd gathered like-minded friends who had skills to complement hers. Tanama nodded. Yuisa took Tanama's hand and dragged her over to one of the benches near the base of the pool. Sit, eat, she waved a spoon at Tanama's face. Tanama took the offered bite. A silky sweetness filled her mouth with the flavors of caramel, custard, and the tropical fruitiness she couldn't name. She took the bowl and spoon from Yuisa and swallowed another bite. It's delicious. But what's that flavor? Mateo piped up, jackfruit. His dark face glowed in the light from the pool. Next to him sat Amero, who added, Yuisa said we're allowed to eat some. Tanama laughed with them. Several years before, Mateo had done a school project about the Asian fruit and discovered that it could be used to store electricity after some special processing. Yuisa had convinced her parents to let her plant a few trees at the edge of their farm. They had begun to produce fruit the previous year, but Yuisa had insisted on experimenting with them rather than eating any. La Granja had its own grove of the trees, but they hadn't reached maturity yet. I didn't know what to do with it, Amero continued. But some of the Asian recipes cook it, so I made flan. The inedible part is better for making batteries, Yuisa added. Might as well eat the rest. Tanama looked down, and most of her portion had disappeared. You could sell this and make a fortune. It's so good. But we don't need to sell anything if we can do everything for ourselves, Yuisa said. She sat next to Tanama and put her arm around her waist. The next morning, as Tanama is leaving for her weekly trip to visit her grandmother at their family farm, she learns that Yuisa and her group are in danger of being evicted from La Granja. She contemplates what to do as she begins her journey inland. The enormous silver tube of the railroad grew as they approached. She'd watched its construction over the 3 years after Super Hurricane Franklin and had run smoothly since then. The US hadn't wanted to repeat its mistakes from Hurricane Maria, so after Franklin, it stepped in with generous support. Life had changed in many ways since then, but Tanama believed that the sea train was the greatest of Puerto Rico's projects. The monorail circled the entire island, making transportation safer and faster by avoiding the inland roads, which always took damage after big storms. The rail's base was an artificial reef that doubled as a breakwater. The water taxis and the train ran on quiet, non-polluting electric motors, and most of the coastline was now protected marine area. During her childhood, the harbor waters had been dark and oily instead of clear and turquoise. Now, jewel-colored parrotfish and wrasse swam in the waters below. As she climbed the stairs to the train station, Tanama shaded her eyes. The rail's tube-shaped cover shone like a mirror under the cloudless sky. Solar cells plastered every sunward surface, and the remainder was covered by painted murals. Mateo had tried to explain to her how the structure also produced electricity from waves, but she found enough joy watching the water rise and fall as she waited on the platform. The system produced enough power to supply multiple coastal cities around the island. Lin-Manuel Miranda and Valeria Blanco had raised money for its constructions, and the United Nations called it the first wonder of the solar-powered world. Her joy evaporated once she was seated and looking at her phone. A string of messages from Yuisa brought more bad news. They'd been served a legal eviction notice, and they had 2 weeks to dismantle La Granja and move off the land. Anything they left behind would belong to the landowner, some businesswoman named Silvia Jove who lived in San Francisco. She left Puerto Rico as a baby and inherited the land from her parents. Tanama arrives at her family farm and finds her grandmother at the local church, charging her devices. The church had a small courtyard built around a tall pole covered in peeling white paint. Solar panels topped the structure and power outlets surrounded the base. After Franklin, the government decided it would be cheaper to give everyone local solar power than to rebuild power lines across the island. People had figured out ways to make these charging stations into social spaces, and her grandmother sat under a wide umbrella with 2 other local ladies, Isabel and Clarita, chatting and laughing as their battery packs and phones charged up. "Tanama, come here," Yaya said, pulling a chair under the shaded umbrella. She examined Tanama closely, as she did every time, though only a week had passed. "What's the matter? Are you sick?" Tanama tried to force a smile and failed. She spilled the news about La Granja, being careful to talk about Yuisa as only a friend. Puerto Rico had made a lot of progress, but her grandmother wouldn't approve of 2 girls dating. Yaya had taken a micrograph from Valeria Blanco to install the solar cloth at the farm, but they hadn't told her that Blanco was a trans woman, afraid that might dissuade her from accepting the money. "And I got into Columbia University," Tanama finished. "But I feel so bad about La Granja. I don't want to go away to New York. Mama says I should go, that Papa would want me to. What do you think?" Yaya patted her hand. "I think you should ask God and then listen to your heart. Then you'll know the right thing to do." Isabel nodded in agreement, but Clarita frowned. "God better tell her to go to the mainland. How are you going to become the next Valeria Blanco if you stay here?" "What about La Granja?" Tanama said. "They're building the future, one that's good for everybody, not just Puerto Rico." Clarita waved a feathered hand like she was shooing a fly. "They're getting evicted. They have to grow up and have families and steady work. You should go to New York." "But I love Yuisa, and I want to make her dream come true."
Hi, I'm Cristina Ochoa, and this is Sunshine State by Adam Flynn and Andrew Dana Hudson. They call it the myth, at least that's what my character Ramses has been told by her shady, gator-loving ex-army buddy Jefferson, who convinces her to trek out to a mysterious, vast compound hidden in the Everglades. Now, the myth might just reveal the secret to the survival of Florida as an unprecedented storm approaches, even if the government is keen on shutting it down. "What the hell have you brought me to, Jeff?" Ramses said as they tied into the flotilla. She found herself thinking of the Dinotopia book she had read when she was little, and how real cities had disappointed her for years afterwards. The myth looked like a combination of botanical gardens, field laboratory, modern art gallery, and Roman bath. Definitely bizarre, but it was also the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Jefferson was fierce-eyed. "This here's the artsy megastructure that better save my gators." Ramses got the full story over hibiscus tea from Nina Mitra, the aquitect in coveralls who waved them in. She was young and turquoise-haired, and she spoke in the clipped phrases one hears when genius aims for intelligibility. The plan was like the Manhattan Project of permaculture, With the weather changing faster every day, wetlands all over the world were dying of lost insects, being stripped by hurricane winds, or withering from rising salinity. So the myth aimed to create a new wetland. Through rapid testing and genetic tweaks, the Aquitect's team of ecosystem hackers was honing in on a combination of swamp grasses, oysters, and thick tropical trees that they believed would turn the sputtering Everglades into an overclocked engine of carbon sequestration, desalination, water filtration, flood mitigation, and topsoil retention. Just a total package of environmental redemption. With giant watercolor flowcharts, they mapped the passage of carbon, nitrates, and methane gas through their synth-bio proving ground. Drop in the right algae bloom here and pH levels will slowly stabilize. Prod the microbiome in a different shape and the new wetland would stop releasing methane. Swap a gene and the mangroves would snake up any man-made support struts. They dragged in hulking beams salvaged from abandoned shipyard cranes and Disney World's roller coaster boneyard. 200 feet high, they coaxed the swamp wispy trees aching to touch a threatening sky. The new wetland not only survived the harsher environments provided by climate change, it positively thrived in them. And it thrived because, and this was a crucial point for Nina, the new wetland was made of weeds. Now, not like kudzu, she insisted, describing their selective use of Terminator seeds for bad actors. Globalized weeds, adapted for a new world. They scattered, adapted, resisted, and survived. And like any good weed, the new wetland wanted to spread. The myth wasn't just their laboratory, it was their working prototype. Nina wanted to take it to scale. That's where you come in, she said to Ramses as they finished their tour. Hacking the Everglades was a project that would take a generation. It required a coalition of committed partners from the surrounding communities. So suburban developers and sprawl salvagers, semi-legal hunters and pseudo-official wildlife enthusiasts like Jefferson, tour guides, business owners, transients, natives. They all had to be sold the unlikely story that southern Florida could be saved, in fact, could be made vital to the planet. So the smart money figures the Everglades are doomed and wants to profit off what comes next. The dumb money refuses to face the facts, Nina shrugged and added. Then there's us. We'd be the weird money, if we had money. But what's with the creepy cult name, Ramses asked finally. Well, the myth has all the wrong connotations for something I need to sell people on. Nina smiled, embarrassed. I joked that what I really wanted was to build a magnificent temple to the human spirit. Someone on email started abbreviating it MTHS, and from there, pretty soon everyone just called it the myth. Ramses laughed. For all their crazy person talk of hope and optimism, the myth people were just still project dorks. She could live with that.
Hi, I'm David Blue, and I'll be reading an excerpt from Corey Pressman's Divided Light. Arizona. It's already a hot, dry state today, threatened with worsening drought, and in the near future, two very different Arizona cities are connected by the fact that it hasn't rained in decades. One is the modern, orderly shade city, nicknamed the Thumb, for the massive corporate solar umbrella that shades its inhabitants while harvesting solar energy. The other is the Raimish Oasis, a colorful desert enclave founded by Middle Eastern immigrants. The sun is not their enemy. Instead, they utilize biomimicry technology to augment plants, animals, and their own bodies to thrive in the arid landscape. Raimish hybrid trees draw up water from deep in the aquifer, spawning pools of liquid, and this is where my character, young Thumb Dweller, is headed to submerge himself the first time. It was my 18th birthday, and we were headed to the Raimish Oasis so I could participate in a new, but noble tradition, dunking my now adult self in the deep dragon tree root pools at the center of the Ramish settlement. These desert denizens possess some genius for biology and air. They engineered giant dragon trees that rooted to the aquifer and drew water hung in the sky. A flotilla of tethered dirigibles populated by the Ramish aquateers of the stratosphere. Each mined the sky for humidity, one drop at a time, sloping the water down to glimmering oasis pools. These hosted a riot of chlorophyll that could be seen for miles. I had never seen a body of water larger than a sink. I had never done more than I had never immersed. Can you imagine, children? We pointed the buggy at the winking green mirage ahead and partied hard as the thumb grew hazy behind us. The thumb, that's what we call Shade City, or to be precise, the huge solar panel sunshade that Umbra Corporation was erecting over town. The giant structure gave us life. It gave us cool shade and clean power, which hadn't fared well in the flare years, but it also evoked a sort of dread. It was a hovering menace. It was the thumb. But not today. Tall clouds assembled in the distance and tucked into the northern horizon. This almost daily assembly was new and a cause for concern for some. This and a recent rash of angry red haboobs. Some whispered a storm was coming, real rain. That was ridiculous. No one here had seen rain in decades, and there was no way we were delaying our party for fear of mythical weather. The Ramish at the gate were guards, a few youths and an elder. It was a piece of work, this one. As the young guards asked us out of the buggy, she came our way, right to me, swathed in purple and green glow robes, bright with captured moonlight. She got in close, enveloping me in that shine. "This is the young shadeling come to cross to old?" She reached out her arm, streaked with shimmering soul tats, and touched my cheek. It smelled like water. I did not move. The Ramish were fairly liberal with whom they led, and heck, they were openly recruiting in Shade City. "Step into the light," sang their swarming folded reed drones. "Join us at the Oasis and make the world." But the old lady seemed like a decider, and being denied entrance on my birthday would be super thummy. Holding my face, she closed her eyes, eyelids aglow with powdered yellow light, and mumbled a fragment of poetry from another century. "Be ignited or be gone." We got back in the buggy. We were in. We headed straight for the pools. It was my first time at the Oasis, and it was overwhelming. Even standing ankle deep in cold water was ecstasy. We yelped with false bravado as we dared each other to step deeper, but immersion was the goal here. I took a few wide, sloshing strides and leapt in. And that is when I drowned. Not to death, mind you, but close. Of course, I couldn't swim. Few from Shade City knew how, and I had just slid deep into the deep end of the pool. The cold water surrounded me. I panicked and flailed, and I lost all sense of up and down. All I could see were bubbles everywhere. My vision dimmed. And then the light. Elena's light. Her facial soul tats glowed a fierce gold as she carefully hove towards me in the chaotic dark. There were arms around me, and I was up and out. And in love. She stood over me as I heaved up a week's worth of water. Her face swam in biographed color as the staccato song of the Ramish-made sun wrens surrounded us. This was such a foreign moment. The almost dying, the edible smell, the swirl of biohacked birds, her tattooed gaze, fascination, and fear. Right here was all the danger and strange that emanated from the Ramish, all the elements of their inscrutable otherness. Why would they engineer cells that way with nanobio hybrids? Until then, I couldn't understand. To adapt yourself to the environment rather than the other way around felt like surrender to the flaring desert. The point of our city, our culture in Shade City, was to keep people safe and free to live as before. We shouldn't have to biohack ourselves or our animals just to survive, to forge Frankenstein trees and spend our days mending cells, soil, and air. It was madness. A single, simple, bold creation, the thumb, the latest engineering wonder of the human race, should be sufficient. Why this multitude of forms when just one would do? But in that moment, I understood one facet of it for the first time. It was astonishingly beautiful. And hers was the most beautiful face I had ever seen.
Hi, I'm Kavi Ramachandran Ladner, and I'm reading Indra's Web by Vandana Singh. This story is set in the small town of Ashapur, India, where my character, Mahua, is a biologist specializing in biomimicry, a field that adapts solutions found in nature to solve human problems. Mahua has built a revolutionary solar energy system of self-regulating sun towers called the Surya Net, modeled after the connected web of mushroom mycelium. The success of this system is the hope of India, and perhaps even the entire biosphere. But while Mahua is processing the imminent passing of her grandmother, something has gone wrong, mysteriously wrong, with her project. There is a fungal network, a myconnect, a secret connection between the plants of the forest. They talk to each other, the acacia and the shisham and the golmahar tree, in a chemical tongue. They communicate about pests, food sources, the weather, all through the flow of biomolecules through the fungal hyphae. Through this network, large trees have even been known to share nutrients with saplings of the same species. Mahua's protege, Namita, is part of the team that helped decipher, to the extent that humans can, this subtle language. In the forest, they had planted sensors in the soil to catch some of the chemical exchanges between plants. The signals are fed back into the interpreter and then analyzed. Some members of the team have made music from the signals, convert the concentration of a certain biochemical transmitter changing in real time into succession of notes where the duration indicates the strength of the transmitter. Add a few other transmitter signals as sounds of a slightly different frequency, and you get a sometimes musical chatter that is at once soothing and intriguing. Mahua is new to this, and she's never tried it out in the forest before. She's always encouraged play in their research. It's not only fun, but important, she tells them. Play leads to new insights, shakes up preconceived notions. And now they need the relief of play. After having spent the past few months calculating and putting in place Ashapur's first smart energy grid, the Surya Net, modeled on the myconnect itself. She took the long way to Sun Tower 1. She always found it calming to walk through Ashapur. The narrow roads were not built on a rectangular pattern, but instead curved, moving obligingly around an ancient peepal tree or dwelling. Her designers had kept the street pattern of the original slum, but had improved on it, allowing room for people to congregate in front of this chai house or in that niche, so that old women could gossip and mind the little ones, and the wandering cows and pariah dogs had room to rest. Here, right in the corner she was passing now, between an internet cafe and an agricultural research center, here's where a potential foreign funder had stopped her 6 years ago. I don't understand. he said. Why this town is so untidy. There's no order, no proper grids for the streets. It looks very inefficient, and the roads are too narrow for traffic flow. Where are the cars? In response to this sort of thing, her grant writing team had developed a slideshow. Apparently, some of these potential funders could only understand things if they were in PowerPoint presentation, to show how optimal city function could be best achieved by having connectivity at multiple scales. Large, coarse, fewer pathways for cars, smaller, more dense ones for people. And for other animals, as well as people, the green corridors that branched into the city, maintaining biodiversity and the psychological benefits of closeness to nature, while providing Ashapur with cooler summers, seasonal supplies of fruits and nuts, and raw material for a new cottage industry and crafts. Now she entered Energy Central, the building below Sun Tower 1. It was cool here. The thick mud-based walls ensured that. And the curving stairway with its murals gave no hint of the troubles of Sun Tower 1, rising high above the roof. At the lab door, there was the familiar sign that Salman had installed by encouraging a vivid green moss to grow on an earth board so that it spelled out the motto of the biomimetic energy materials lab: to learn from nature, not to exploit her. His colleagues had teased Salman that the irony of exploiting a moss to write these noble words, but the moss seemed to have decided things for itself. It spelled to learn from natur, not to explode, which still made her smile. Inside, there was a dim coolness and the glow of multiple terminals. A meeting was in progress, chaotic and impassioned as usual. Arguments and discussions in Hindi, English, and Bangla. Salman, deep in agitated conversation with Namita and Ayush. Hamid, a young trainee who had once begged on the streets as a child, patiently explaining the situation to the boy who had brought the tea. Mahua stayed just inside the door, unnoticed, letting the words flow around her, sensing the web of ideas and feelings raging through the room. No guarantee that modeling the SuryaNet on the micronet was going to work. Why risk everything on one crazy idea? Calculations, have you forgotten we did the entire constructional analysis? Besides, scale-free networks are everywhere. Nobody's networked a Suryan-based system before or allowed it to self-regulate. There were safer ways of doing this, better ways, but no, you have to go on about minimal control. It's centralized control systems that make everything work. Yeah, stop being a control freak, okay? We're just mimicking the natural control system that exists in nature. Stop panicking. Obviously, there's a bug in the system somewhere. Oldest sun tower, beta version of the Scirens, it's bound to fail. Not this quickly, idiot. Chanchal was from one of the terminals. Salman, look what's happening to the other sun towers. Energy collection is now above average by 7%, 2, 3, and 4. But dekho, boss, these numbers, more inflow than outflow. There's a major bug somewhere. Our energy is no longer conserved, someone said, as there was a mass movement on the terminal. Mahua found herself curiously detached from the mayhem. A signal sounded repetitively in the lab, like the beep of the monitor in her grandmother's hospital room. She remembered the first time she sees these young people in various colleges and universities nearly a decade ago. They were brilliant and bound for brilliant careers as engineers, managers, CEOs, their upturned faces curious, skeptical, polite. She had nothing to offer them, so she gives it all she has. I come to you with empty hands, she says. I can't offer you much money. I can't offer you big houses, 2 cars, 5 air conditioners, nor the jet-setting lifestyle with its cross-continental board meetings, the wife or husband who will ultimately cheat on you, the children who will drive you crazy. What I can give you is a chance to be a part of a revolution that might just save our Earth from the climate crisis, one that comes up with not just new technologies, but new ways to live that are more whole and deep and satisfying than anything you've known. Most of you have enjoyed being in college. You're the best of the lot, the ones who get high on learning and on the company of like minds. The Ashapur Project is like college, except that you have the chance to learn by doing and do more good than you could ever wish with the life now laid out for you. We will take care of your housing and your healthcare, and you will get as much salary as I do, which isn't saying very much. But you'll get up every morning knowing that by the end of the day, you would have made a new discovery, a new friend, a new way of looking at the world. You will blow old paradigms out of existence on a near daily basis. I promise you that. Are you with me?
Hi everybody, my name is Gia Mora and I have been an environmentalist ever since I saw Bette Midler celebrating Earth Day on TV. And she was talking about putting a brick in the tank of your toilet to reduce water usage. So 5-year-old me wandered out to the backyard, grabbed a brick, went to put it in the toilet and promptly cracked the toilet tank, flooding the bathroom. I am so sorry, Mom and Dad. That story, like a lot of other individual efforts to halt the effects of climate change, embodies the challenges of asking global citizens to do their part. Even if the action is successful, unlike mine was, how is any one person supposed to maintain that environmental enthusiasm when all of that action feels like just a drop in the already polluted ocean? We need a new story, one that moves from the individual to the collective. And today I'm here to talk about the ways that you can help write the story of our future. A great place to begin is where your passions lay. Do you care about human rights, education, fashion, food, conservation, technology, transportation, animal rights? All of these disciplines intersect with climate disruption in a measurable and actionable way. And your role in the story doesn't have to be the lead. I'm no Joaquin Phoenix wearing the same suit the entire award season, but I do work in entertainment and I love wearing secondhand clothes on the red carpet. Incorporating my climate action into my passions feels authentic and keeps me motivated to inspire others through my behavior. Once you've discovered your eco-action lane, the next step is to find communities, whether it's online or in real life, who also use their passions to inspire others. Because let's face it, it's easier and more enjoyable to do things in a group. Whether you get involved with a beach cleanup or your city government, or even finding just a group of like-minded climate storytellers, all of those individual actions can add up to much more in a group. Today, there are so many people hungry for these kinds of communities. Back in 2008, when my sister and I made a pledge not to buy anything new that wasn't a consumable good, our friends thought we were freaks. Now they call us for advice. Conversations about consumption and carbon expenditure are no longer impolite dinner party topics. Now here's where the real storytelling begins. We must tell ourselves that there is a safe, habitable, and just future for everyone. That is the only way we will all collectively work toward that future. And admittedly, that work is hard. Climate action demands that we live more fully with less, and that we change societal benchmarks. It's not how new your car is, it's how long your car lasts you. When your climate actions are aligned with your passions and you have a supportive community around you, then those actions make a splash in the ocean instead of just a drop. So, join me in jumping off of that great Pacific garbage patch and into the ocean. Somewhere in the deep blue sea, we will find our story together.
Hello. I want to thank all of our performers for your wonderful, wonderful readings. Mark, Tara, Mansi, Cristina, David, and Kavi, thank you so much for lending your talents to these stories. And a big thanks to Giamora for sharing your own personal eco-activism journey and your inspiring thoughts on how we can all find our own pathways to action. It's the perfect bridge to our panel conversation. So just as a reminder to everybody listening, if you have questions for our panelists, put them in the chat and we will ask them towards the end of the panel. We are so thrilled to have this incredible group of speakers with us today. Honestly, they have so many accomplishments that we'd be here all day if I gave you their full bio, so here are some highlights. Dr. Kate Marvel is a research scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, teaches in Columbia University's Masters in Climate and Society program, and her 2017 TED Talk has been viewed over 1 million times, and fun fact, She originally went to school to become an actress, one of the many reasons we're so thrilled to have her here today. Vandana Singh is an author, a professor of physics at Framingham State University, and an interdisciplinary researcher on the climate crisis. You heard her story, Indra's Web, just a few minutes ago. Dr. Manjana Milkoreit is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oslo's Department of Sociology and Human Geography. Her research is centered at the intersection of political science, cognitive science, and how social change is created. She's also one of the founders of the Imagination and Climate Futures Initiative at ASU, and is a co-editor of Everything Change, an anthology of climate fiction, which includes Sunshine State, also read earlier. And of course, you have already met my Scirens co-founder, Taryn O'Neill. What you might not know about Taryn, because she's one of the most humble people on this planet, is that she is the award-winning writer and director of the sci-fi short Live, which has been watched over 500,000 times. And she made her feature directorial debut last year. Yeah, that's right. She shot safely during a pandemic. So welcome, everyone. I actually want to start with a top-line question that's really the basis, or we could say the hypothesis, for this whole event. For all of you, in both your personal and professional opinions, how can providing more optimistic stories of climate innovation, rather than the dystopian futures we so often witness, help in encouraging people to take action on climate issues? Or can it? Is it just wishful thinking to think that these stories actually matter? Dr. Kate Marvel, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So from a physical science perspective, doom and gloom is boring, and it is not inevitable. I feel like the number one question that I get asked is there any hope? And I maybe, but the answer is we don't really need hope. We need to do stuff. And the doom narrative, the narrative that the future is already written, that nothing can be done, that human beings peaked at the extraction of fossil fuels. I just don't believe that's possible. And the science doesn't support that. And so I think finding narratives that are more constructive, finding narratives that actually get us off of our backsides and get to work, I think is really helpful.
And Manjana, what about you? You've actually used the term for climate fiction, a cognitive emotional time machine. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Absolutely. So the question whether and how stories matter is a big one. And we know a little bit about that. I don't think we know enough about that. We know that people learn from stories and they learn through stories. So we know that our brains actually need stories to make sense of the world as it is. And we need stories to make sense of possible futures. We know, for example, from science fiction, research on that one, that some science fiction actually has inspired real technological developments and changes in the world. Some stories also have affected leaders of nations to make certain decisions. So in rare circumstances, we can find that. But I think the bigger question of how can we use story today to mobilize people to think about what kind of future they want, and how to achieve them, how to see themselves maybe in those stories and in those futures, that is a really big and important question.
So in light of that, Vandana and Taryn, I'd love to talk a little bit about the process of creating these kinds of stories. How do the two of you as writers balance the science and the storytelling to create a compelling narrative?
I can jump
Vandana,
in if
you
you like.
start.
Okay. Yeah. Well, first I want to tease apart the meaning of the term positive, because we can have empty Pollyannish positivism, that is detached from reality, or the privileged positivity of people at the apex of the power pyramid who know that they are not going to, lose that much if, as the climate disruption unravels. So the kind of positivity that I try to write about is the kind that comes through actually dealing with on-ground reality. And then despite, and so in fact, through and because of walking through the valley of despair and fear and all of those things, actually emerging from that into something where you can really act. And we see this with marginalized communities around the world. So the way that I like to balance these things as somebody with a background in my PhDs in particle physics, although I haven't done that for a while. But I mostly work in an interdisciplinary kind of climate communication in a way, but based on the science, but going beyond that. And my fiction writing mimics that as well. So to me, in a way, science is a way of telling stories, and particularly physical science and physics is a way of us humans eavesdropping on the conversations of nature. And so to me, I don't see it as necessarily two things at loggerheads. In fact, the stories that science tells kind of flows through storytelling into the story of the human that I'm trying to tell. So that's where I would go with that.
And I think as an extension, I've always found the most wonder and awe in my life through nature, through science. And so I'm just innately fascinated by understanding the physical world, what we can see and not see. And so science then informs my storytelling, and I just try to root it in those emotions that science evokes, as opposed to trying to go from a top-down approach in the projects I create and write, and trying to like come up with this high concept idea that may be sellable and then try to fit science into it. I really try to, I'm just naturally inspired by science, by physics, and letting the story sort of grow from there, and then making sure that that story is rooted in like a very human emotion so that it can be universal, hopefully, and not someone needing, you know, a huge foundational understanding of science in and of itself.
Can I follow up with a question?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
Do you guys then think that good stories that we need have to be, let's say, true to science? Do they have to be rooted in climate science to be effective or to be valuable in having a climate conversation?
Okay, yes.
I have an opinion on that. I want to hear what everybody else is thinking.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I think when I read bad science fiction, it really stands out, right? Because bad world building is, oh, I forgot to tell you that this person has this power and it solves all these problems. And also there's this weird language you don't understand that I totally forgot to establish. So we know what bad world building is, and good world building is everything is coherent. Everything makes sense according to a certain internal logic. And what I do, I build climate models. A climate model is literally a world building machine. We can do things in a climate model that we could never do in the real world. We can make the earth spin backwards. We can fill, and I have done this, you can fill the entire atmosphere with molasses to see what happens. You can set up a volcano in London. You can do all this weird stuff that you would never do in a real world. You can also do things like zero out fossil fuel emissions tomorrow and see what happens. And for me, the really powerful thing about that climate model is that you get worlds that are not exactly our own. Maybe they're the worlds that used to be. Maybe they're the worlds that could have been. Maybe there are different futures we can look at. But the really powerful thing is that internal logic, is the fact that you are building coherent worlds. So I think in answer to your question, I don't think fiction necessarily needs to accord with climate science perfectly, but I think it does need to abide by a certain internal logic so that it makes sense, so that the worlds that are built are rich and are understandable. And I think climate modeling, climate science, and science in general can really help with that.
To sort of know your rules and your structure before you break it. Acknowledging that.
I would agree with that. It's like, you know, somebody trying to write, you know, without knowing the rules of grammar, you break the rules of grammar, that's just terrible writing. But then if you know the rules of grammar and you creatively break them, that's different. So I agree.
So in this world building that we're doing, something that I've noticed about some of the stories that were read here today is that they feature solutions that are happening at a communal level, and many of them include a measure of independence from government structures. So I'm curious to put the question out there, why do you think this is a common theme? And do you think that these types of situations are going to be a part of our climate future? Is this just sort of wishful thinking, imaginative narrative?
I think to some extent, and this might also be the result of the observation that our national governments have really struggled and taken a long time to come up with effective solutions. And it's very hard for the individual to connect what our governments are doing, for example, at COP26 in Glasgow for the last couple of weeks, and what that means for real change on the ground, right? This is mentally really hard to tell that story, how that international negotiation business translates into action on the ground. The community scale is where the real change has to take place and where future life of people will take place. So no matter how we get there, this is as a crucial scale to make these social transformations happen. And therefore imagining at that scale of what might happen, what could contribute, or what the post-transformation world would look like, I think that is a really challenging and interesting task right now. And I'm glad to see it show up so many stories in so many different ways. It's another dimension of the storytelling. We need many stories, many ideas, and diversity in our ways of thinking about possible futures to help us build these pathways and get inspired about where we might want to end up.
And so,
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go.
I was just going to add one quick thing. I agree with what my fellow panelists have said. But I think one additional reason is that these things are also happening. Like in India alone, there are hundreds of experiments on the ground, not necessarily centered on climate change, but on alternative ways to live and be. Often, experiments that are run by grassroots communities who have their backs against the wall, who are facing, socioeconomic distress on top of climatic and other changes, as well as massively destructive so-called development projects. So these experiments are already happening on the ground, and there's a global version there's a website called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So, and people need to tell these other kinds of stories, and they are very, very diverse stories, as Taryn said. And we need to hear them. We have the top down, and that's important, but it needs to be shaped and informed by the bottom up. So I think that's one reason why these stories are so important.
And so along those lines, we read a lot of things in the news about what's happening around the world in different communities. And certainly we've all seen a lot of charts and graphs lately about the countries that are contributing most to climate issues and the countries that are affected the most by it. And there's often a disparity between those two. So how do you think that fiction can help share the stories of the way climate change affects marginalized and under-resourced community in a way that a spreadsheet or a news article or a science report maybe can't? Vandana, I see you smiling.
Kate, I know you need to leave shortly, so I want to make sure we get you in.
Yeah, please, Kate, do go ahead first.
Oh no, I want to hear from you first.
Well, I'll try to be quick. By the way, I really admire your Scientific American columns. You're one of the few scientists who writes like a poet, and I really appreciate that. But anyway, so part of what I do in the pedagogy of climate change, I try to come up with radical pedagogies for climate change that are not just about the science, but also justice. And that's exactly what I try to do in the fiction. And that's where marginalized communities must inform how we think about the future. So for instance, I'm in touch with communities in a desertified part of India, desertified by deforestation as well as climatic changes. And there's a woman who in the past 20 years, has led an effort, and these are among the poorest of the poor, led an effort to revitalize and grow their degraded forest. And they have been successful in protecting it from the timber mafia, for example. And these women are heroes, and they should be, at the UN COP summit, people like them should be helping set policy. So I bring them into my stories. Like in this story, Indra's Web, Mahua, the protagonist, actually is somebody who is from a displaced tribal community. And I've written another story about her too, when she's 73 years old and looking back on her life. So I personally have learned so much from marginalized people's experiences, indigenous people's experiences and epistemologies that I cannot but put them both in my academic work and in my fiction.
Can I add a little bit to that? So I think that one of the real power of stories, and I think we've had this just demonstrated in the most beautiful way, is to make climate change and these future realities real, to humanize this problem and to allow the reader or the listener to step into a different world through the eyes of a character, a person.
right? You start to mentally simulate the world of somebody else. And that makes climate justice issues so much more real than any graph, any number, any discussion at the COP can do for a person. And I think that's the real power. If you are able to enter the world of a marginalized community or people who are very different from yourself and learn about that world through even their emotional experience, their interaction with the climate, their community, their ways of life, that really gives you a different sense of reality, future possibility, and urgency. And so that is, I think, what stories can do for us if we take the time to read them. So I want to also thank everybody who's been reading today, and Vandana's stories are part of that. So this is very important to have this conversation through story.
Well, speaking of that, I know Kate has to go in just a moment. So this is a question I want to pose to all of you, but I'd love her to answer it first. So So you all represent different and multiple points of expertise in the climate conversation: writing, science, research, education, government policy. So Taryn and I, as Scirens, plan to host more of these climate storytelling events and bring together the science and entertainment communities. And we want to lobby to get more climate-infused, say that 3 times fast, climate-infused stories told. So is there something that we as creatives in Hollywood can do differently, or something you'd like to see? Like Kate, for example, when you were that freshman drama major, what's the role that you would have loved to have played on the big screen? What's the story you're not seeing right now?
I think somebody should make a movie where Liam Neeson goes around punching fossil fuel executives. Like, I will totally watch that movie, for sure. I also think somebody should watch or should make a movie where, you know, The Rock goes back in time and survives 5 mass extinctions. I would definitely watch that movie. I feel like, you know, I think somebody should make a movie where a bunch of scientists warn the world about an incoming threat, and everybody listens and takes appropriate action. And then the last 2 hours of the movie is a romantic comedy. Like, they should make that movie. You know, I feel like there is so much space for creative thinking here. And I'm so happy to do something like this, because I feel like so many conversations I have with creators, it always goes back to the same story, which is that there's an apocalypse and it's your fault personally. And then why doesn't anybody want to watch this? Why doesn't anybody want to read this? Why doesn't anybody want to engage with this? And I just think that story, you know, there's probably a role for it, but it's not the only story. And I think it's really played out.
Thank you so much. We so appreciate your being here and bringing your expertise and your point of view. We know you have to run, but we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kate.
Bye.
Yeah.
All right. So Manjana, Vandana, Taryn, other thoughts on this topic about what you'd like the creative community, how you'd like them to respond to climate fiction stories?
I don't know, you want to go first?
I would like to see more movies or creative work in which you know, which we are immersed in alternative possible realities, you know, where the everyday things we take for granted, like this is the way to live, this is the way, you know, the 9-to-5 job, the way we commute, the way we think about work, the way we think about relationships, the way we define family, the way we always move in the exclusively human, you know, like everything we do, most of the things we do is about human to human. Why not immerse ourselves in alternative realities, especially those informed by, for example, indigenous ways of thinking and being and knowing? That's one of them. And the other thing is that I think we need to see more movies about the power of social change and how that can happen. Because, you know, we've just seen the whole debacle of the COP26, the UN COP26, which was such a damp squib, you know, compared to what needs to be done. And that means that the responsibility, of course, we have to keep pushing governments and corporations, but the responsibility is heavy on our shoulders, on all of us in all possible different ways. So I really want to understand how through history, social change has worked. And so we want to see, I would love to see movies that show how things change through social movements and through people reimagining the world. So I'd like to see more of that.
I think you just teed up Manjana perfectly, because this is an area of study. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. We need stories, if it's movies or books or short stories, that tell pathway stories. How do we get from here to there? And they're really rare. Sometimes you have we're already in that future, and you get kind of the mirror viewer look backwards, like what was history like to come to this place through the memories of the characters. But we need those kinds of stories that tell us how change unfolds and how social forces can create major shifts in our ways of being. So some work on that exists, but we certainly need more of that in the entertainment world, I think. But I also had a couple of suggestions of what entertainers or writers or authors could do if they have the choice at this point in time. If you have a choice between writing a story or taking a role that has a climate or a non-climate dimension, take a climate one. This is such an urgent and all-important thing right now that really, if you can contribute to this, try to enter this conversation, even if it's hard. If you have questions or challenges with the scientists are happy to help. People like Kate and others reach out to us, also not just the climate science, but the social science. Many of us would be very happy to work with you. And so I would hope and encourage everybody to move towards this field that needs more storytelling and that needs courageous people who are entering it and telling these new kinds of stories. And maybe finally, because our research on how stories actually affect different people is still thin, I would love to invite everybody who is interested to come and reach out to me and to Ed to help us study the effects of climate future stories on different kinds of readers. We would like to actually study that. Like, what kinds of story has what kind of effect on what kind of audience? We do know that different audiences read the same story in very different ways. And if we want to understand better what the power of story could be and how to create the good kind of stories, we need a little more research on that. So if you're interested in that, we would be super open to any of your ideas, whether it's as a fly on the wall, a story co-generator, or a research participant. Please reach out.
Jana knows I'm already like in. I'm getting involved in that. I want to do a shout out to my friend Anna Jane Joyner, who is in the midst of finishing up her climate screenwriting handbook. So it's going to be a resource for Hollywood writers on how to include climate change narratives in their projects. And she's been a climate activist for about a decade now. So this is a big passion project of her, and she interviewed me about it and probably like 30 other industry people. When it comes to sort of from my perspective and sort of the power of story, and I'm enamored with in research a lot, just this power of narrative sort of on our heart-brain connections and how it creates action. I get concerned how story has become so marginalized and commodified. It's like little 8-second bites where we're competing with all this social media content, and story is just sort of lumped in there where it was the most ancient transmission of information between generations, and we've lost that. So I'm really interested to figure out how we can, as storytellers, as filmmakers, elevate story again within community, sort of just within the general societal narrative. And also, what are these new forms that technology can help us with, whether it's artificial intelligence or virtual reality? Film gives us this incredible opportunity to go into somebody else's actual perspective, their POV, just like a book can bring us into their mind. So I think that we, have some opportunities to do some unique storytelling in the future, or at least I hope we do.
I hope so too. I can't believe we're almost at the end of this event. I want to respect everybody's time. So I'm going to actually shift over to some questions that we've gotten from our audience members. Mark Gora asks, have groups studied climate and social narratives and their impact on children? How and when do we begin engaging the next generation, and what seems to work best?
I can try and tackle that. I'm not aware of specific studies with children, but obviously that would be a very good starting point. I'm pretty certain there is emerging work on that right now. For example, I know that the Center for Science and the Imagination is exploring the idea of working with school children or education to figure out what the role of story could be in climate education and in that context. But I can't tell you any specific insights at this point about the effects on children and children's stories.
Got it. Roberto asks, when it comes to co-writing the future through radical, optimistic science fiction, like solar punk stories, how evident should one be regarding the fact that these stories are looking to build a better future, almost through both the conscious and the unconsciousness experience of the receptor? And he writes, dystopian narratives were never trying to affect our reality as they have, yet they did. Could it be that making very obvious that we are actively trying to change the narrative could jinx the effect of those stories?
That's such a cool question for a researcher, because yes. it's like the interesting idea here is that our stories could be the Trojan horse into people's minds, because our normal communication forms have not worked, right? For many, many years, decades now, we've been trying to bring the climate story to the forefront and trying to say change has to happen and has to happen fast, and it hasn't, right? So now we're hoping that maybe story is a way to slip it in, especially with audiences that are not convinced that it's a real thing or it's a real problem right now, that it opens up conversation space because it's entertainment, it's easy, you can embrace it. But if it's too obvious and it has a mission, suddenly it becomes politics. And if it becomes politics and I can see that on the face of it, then maybe your reader doesn't want to have a part in it and he doesn't even pick up the book, or she doesn't even pick up the book. So this is an interesting tension maybe between how forward you are. I think ultimately what you want is good stories. A good story will find its audience. And so rather than focusing on how can I change somebody's mind, because I don't think you will turn anybody around from being a climate denier to being somebody who goes protesting for climate action, that's not going to happen. So as long as I think the mission always has to be to write good stories. But again, there's a little bit of a tension. I don't know, Vandana might have a particular perspective here because she's been doing it. She's been in this business.
I wish I could say one way or the other, but I do believe that the story has to stand, as a story. And when I write a story, I have to drop, I cannot write to a particular moral, because then the story just derails. I have to follow the characters. I have to let the story find its way. But it's inevitable that the things that are important to me will surface in the story. So that's all right. I think that stories can be persuasive. And also there's also perhaps room for stories that very passionately put through one particular point of view, as long as it comes organically through the storytelling, which goes back to Manjana's point about good stories. So I think there's, Emily Dickinson said, right, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And that's, I think, particularly one of the virtues of speculative fiction, that by building other worlds and other realities, we open our minds to our own world and our own realities. So I think there's a lot to be said for that oblique approach to storytelling.
Taryn?
Let's move on to another question. I want to make sure that we get, I think these are incredible answers.
Okay, I do also want to make note that Joey asked a question that I think you both just answered about, can we expect climate fiction to function persuasively, or as it means function to inspire? So Vandana, you intuited that question and answered it. So Joey, thank you for asking that. And I think our last question for today is from Pamela, who asks, how can we make these stories part of everyday life, prompting every person to think about their role? I often think back to the posters and PSA type presentations during World War II and wonder why we're not seeing something like that regarding climate change.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, thought-provoking direction, I think, to move into. We're in the researcher world of thinking a lot about maybe what you could call scaffolding for a story. The story experience on its own, reading a short story or a novel or going to a movie, might have a short-term effect on a moviegoer or a reader. But then really for this to move into your life and to have a more extended long-term effect, you might need further interaction. Either you talk to somebody about this, or social media interactions might matter. Having a community reading or a community opportunity to engage in and with the ideas that come from these books is really important to keep them alive and to maybe start translating them into your own life. So the stories themselves are necessary starting points, but likely not enough to generate any kind of serious change. So then how do you build the scaffolding, or what kinds of social community opportunities do you need to take these stories into your real life? I don't know, that I'm sure there are good ideas out there. I haven't yet seen anything that's very intentional around this, but I can imagine that a lot can be done in this area.
May I add something here?
Please.
I'm actually really excited about this possibility. So thanks, Pam, for the question. And thanks, Manjana, for what you said, because jumping off of that, that's actually something that I've been feeling more and more passionate about, the need for storytelling to stop being merely a communication from one mind to another, or other minds, between the reader and the author, or the viewer and the screen, or whatever. And to really have it go back to the community tradition. Like, I come from a culture that has 5,000 years of oral traditions, as well as the written word. And that's one of my newer stories that are not out yet, but I'm actually working with exactly that these are stories designed to be told to other people, aloud, in community. And it's just an experiment. I don't know how it'll go, but I'm motivated by exactly that need and that gap.
Well, I've got one final question for everybody. I'd actually love to close with a call to action or a sharing of knowledge. Our audience, as we mentioned, brings together a combination of people from both the science communities and the entertainment communities, and those of us who have a foot in each. So if folks have been inspired by what they've heard here today, either through this panel discussion or the stories, what would you advise as a next step, or what directive would you like to give them about how to use their talents and skills? Manjana?
Yeah, I guess I can repeat what I said earlier. Become very conscious about your choices of the roles you pick up, the stories you write, and how they relate to climate change. Like what role you give climate change in your artistic work. I think that really matters, that we more consciously dare to step into that area, which is still challenging. There are still, I think, lots of obstacles to telling really good climate stories in the major medias, but also smaller opportunities. So think about that. Then again, back to the question of the role of science. Yes, if you try to tackle that challenge of taking science seriously and reach out if you need help, but don't feel tethered to the science. The good story doesn't have to be true to science to be a good, impactful stories. I've been reading and evaluating climate fiction stories for our ASU contest. I've seen amazing stories that move away from reality into more magical or unreal worlds that really make a very strong point, for example, about climate justice. So don't feel tied to, you have to be real to the science to write a good story about climate change or to tell a good story. And then again, the invitation to come and work with us to find out how stories can make a difference. That'd be my 3 points.
Excellent. Vandana?
I think that a couple of things to make note of. One is that to recognize that we are actually not alone. We live in individualistic societies which have become globalized, but that's actually an illusion. Every breath we take is connected to other species and through the entire history of our beautiful planet. So one of the things that I would recommend to people is to form networks or join existing ones, and be conscious of the elephant in the room with regard to climate action. It's not as though we don't have the good ideas or the technologies or the alternative ways of living and being. It's power that stands in the way. So how do we tell stories that challenge the current status quo? How do we do that? And finally, the other thing is that I think we should also start, we have different identities, right? We identify with nations or religions and whatnot. And that's fine. What someone wants to do, who am I to tell them not to? But I would like to plead with people to start thinking of themselves as in two ways, as earthlings, as global inhabitants of our planet, but also as locally attached to the land, something that indigenous people, for instance, know what they're talking about when they say they are attached to the land. And we don't know, we've lost that. So how do we get back to that? So be simultaneously local and planetary. And I think that's part of what is meant by being an earthling.
Love that. I love that. Taryn, final words?
I love that. And Vandana wrote a beautiful short story called 5 interconnected stories called Entanglement. And entanglement in physics is something that has inspired a lot of my work, and this connected nature of sort of all beings. And I would love to adapt entanglement into a movie one of these days. I guess what I would like to say to people is two-front. One, if you're in the business, start greenlighting and putting money towards climate stories. Like, we just need to, it can't be this niche genre. As Margaret Atwood said, climate change is everything change. I mean, it really is permeating everything of our lives. And we just need to have a net neutral approach to it almost, because climate has this negative connotation where people are going to think it's, oh, it's a gloom and doom story, or it's some like, you know, hippie, like there's just so many bad sort of stereotypes associated with climate that we really need to undo. And so Hollywood needs to be better and put more money towards this. And then people need to empower themselves to tell their own stories. You know, we just, as Vandana was saying, we need global stories. We need stories from all sorts of communities. And there's a network, a beautiful growing network, especially in the solar punk community. So start writing, start sharing, start creating a narrative network around, and these stories can start permeating larger groups.
Well, I could talk to you all day, but our time together is drawing to a close. So Vandana, Manjana, thank you so much for lending your time and your talents to this conversation today. It is so appreciated.
Thank you very much
Very
for
grateful.
running this event. This is so important to have this conversation, and I'm very grateful for you to do this. So thanks for the invitation, for having me.
And thank you to both of you and to Kavi and the other readers. This was such a wonderful experience and such a rich discussion. And I really appreciate the audience as well. Thank you all.
Well, hopefully it's the beginning of many more conversations about this.
Just a huge thanks to all of our performers and speakers involved today. If you want to follow them on social media, we will have a post on our Scirens website that has all the event information, everybody involved, all their websites, their Twitter and social media handlers. And to stay in touch with us in the social media verse, we're at Scirens. On Twitter, we're Scirens Official at Instagram and Scirens at Facebook. And our website is scirens.com.
And as I was saying, we hope this is the first of many climate storytelling events as we all figure out how to do this together. And so speaking of stories, I want to leave you with a quote that will hopefully inspire. In All We Can Save, which is a wonderful collection of essays and poems about the climate crisis by female identifying authors, Fabiana Rodriguez writes, "For thousands of years, humans use the stars to tell stories, to help make sense of their lives, to orient them on the planet. Stories work in the same way. When many stars coalesce around similar themes, they form a narrative constellation that can disrupt business as usual. They reveal patterns and help illuminate that which was once obscured. We need more transformational stories so that we can connect the dots and shift narratives. The climate movement has largely left storytellers and culture out of its strategy toolbox. Now is the time to change that." Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We're all in this together.